If everyone's okay with that, I figure we get started. Come back to Student Success Committee. If everyone's okay. So I guess before we get started, seems like I asked really quick of change things around a little bit because we have some people sign up for public comment. It was about the JROTC. But the only thing we have on our agenda today is talking about equitable grading practices. So I figured we would have public comment go first. That way you can if you want, but you don't have to sit through the whole entire discussion about equitable grading practices. If that's okay with everyone.
Yes.
Right. Great. So should we just do quick introductions really quick, and then we'll do public comment, and then talk about equitable grading practices. Terry, you want to start?
Yes, hi, Terry Schmarter, Communications Department. Philip Christie, Senior Director for High School Core Academics.
Richard Smith, Director of Middle Grades Redesign.
Good evening. I'm Joanna Tobin, Senior Director for Middle Grades Core Academics and Redesign.
Christina Howard, Interim Chief Academic Officer.
Eddie Wong, Chair.
Patty Sullivan, Director.
Assistant Superintendent Elementary.
Oh, my name is Mike Reising. Just live here.
John Gresham.
Herschel Soul.
Sylvia Hart Landsberg, also with Recruiter Watch. Community.
Cheryl Proctor, Deputy Superintendent.
Roseanne Powell, Board Manager.
Kara Bradshaw, Executive Assistant. And we did have both, except we do have JJ also.
Try to bring in our students.
Yeah. JJ, can you hear us? When we promote you to panelists, you have to accept the request though. Well, we can keep trying to bring them over.
Okay. Great. Yeah, let's get started with public comment.
Herschel Scholes.
Okay. Souls. I want to respond to a couple of comments I heard last time, and one of them they're talking about JROTC, and they're trying to keep keep people from dropping out of school. But I think JROTC is really the wrong thing to do. You know, in the United States, we have a huge military budget, and I think the solution to keeping people in the school is what the teachers are saying: reduce class size. Now, Cuba has a student-teacher ratio of 1 to 12, and they had a test down there several years ago in Cuba, and they had surprising results. So they said they must have made a mistake. Let's test it again. They tested again with the same results. Class size really makes a difference. Another thing on the or a comment I made, that you can go to the 7-Eleven and get shot. To me, that's a fairly callous comment. And there are a lot of other things that happen when you go in the military. One of them is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And it's really a serious thing. It kind of, just that alone kind of debilitates people, and making them kind of difficult to maybe have a career by maybe doing things that you don't want to do, or by seeing your friends bleed out. It's a very, very serious thing, what we do in the military. And I think it's really kind of irresponsible to be sending out people or putting people in the military to kind of be the enforcer of foreign policy, when a lot of people, I'm assuming a lot of people right here don't know what the foreign policy is. And I recommend if anybody wants to know what our foreign policy is, you can read the book Murder Incorporated by Mumia, Jamal?
Yes.
You know anybody? Abu Jamal. Mumia Abu Jamal. Yeah. He has a real critical of our U.S. foreign policy. And I just think as a group here, you should know what you're sending these people in. McNamara had a policy during the Vietnam War to send black people into the front lines. They were expendable. So to me, having the JROTC kind of come to the schools is kind of a continuation of this sending them, kind of endangering their lives because they're expendable. They really disapprove of that. It's kind of a real racist attitude. Gosh, one more point here. I don't know. Find out what the foreign policy is before you. Well, I know. Supposedly they're not going to be doing any recruiting, which is really an absurd notion. Because if you have a retired, untrained in education person, they're going to be talking about experiences they had. You know, the places they went, the people they met, everything they say will kind of be a military recruitment. And if you were to read Mumia Abu Jamal, you would say that's really not the foreign policy we want. Thank you.
John Gresham?
Yeah, just a quick reminder, I forgot to remind earlier, I'm very
Okay,
sorry.
if I sit here?
Yeah, absolutely. The timer is the 2-minute warning, right? And the public comments is 3 minutes. So when you hear the timer, try to wrap things up quickly. Thank you. Yeah, sorry for not reminding earlier.
Okay, my name is John Greshow, and I'm the coordinator for the War Resisters League here in Portland. At our last meeting, I shared some thoughts about generally recognized problems with JROTC programs for your consideration. This time, I want to share with you a few points from an article written by a teacher at Reynolds High School in Troutdale. Reynolds has had a JROTC program as part of its program since 2011. This teacher writes, the potential presence of the military. Oh, hold on just a second. I want to pass these around. This is the article I'm referring to. The potent presence of the military at RHS shines a floodlight on education inequity. At RHS, college recruiters are few and far between. But military recruiters, JROTC commanders, and ASVAB, that's Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery testers, clamor to establish daily contact with potential recruits. All too often I hear the refrain, well, the military is a good option, or perhaps the only option for many kids. As educators, we must ask critical questions. Whose interests do we ultimately serve by welcoming the military into our poorer schools? Is it really in any of our students' best interest? What are the qualifications of the JROTC instructors? What does the JROTC curriculum actually teach our students? Then she adds, JROTC is not about education. By housing JROTC in public schools and offering them carte blanche privileges, we provide them a cloak of legitimacy. This Reynolds teacher describes how RHS has embraced school-based initiatives, including a commitment to restorative justice and peer mediation that teaches and encourages students to resolve conflicts nonviolently. JROTC's militarism runs counter to these programs. Schools across the country are employing a variety of methods to curb bullying and violent incidents, create safe learning environments, and teach peaceful means of conflict resolution. JROTC's introduction of weapons training, its partnership with the NRA to sponsor marksmanship matches, and its modeling of authoritarian militaristic solutions to problems contradicts the school's stated opposition to violence. This teacher reminds us that in 2014, after this program had been at Reynolds for 3 years, an avid and apparently mentally unstable JROTC student at RHS armed himself with a semi-automatic rifle and pistol, a knife, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He fatally shot one student and injured a teacher before police cornered him, and he took his own life. This tragedy highlights the importance of closing down programs that feed violent tendencies in vulnerable students and contradict school-based efforts to teach nonviolent conflict resolution.
Thank you.
Michael Prisner.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Preisner. I live in Multnomah County. I met my first Army recruiter when I was 15 at my high school. Like most boys at that age, I expressed an interest in the military, or rather, I expressed an interest in the fantasy version of the military I had in my head. So they kept in close touch with me on campus. They became mentors in a way, and they convinced me to join by the time I was 16. And days after my 17th birthday, they convinced me to join before my senior year. They convinced me to enlist through what is known as the delayed entry program. I did so because I knew I had no way to pay for college. I didn't have the grades for a scholarship, and they assured me that the delayed entry program would help me in the long run rather than waiting for graduation. But throughout senior year, I developed a different dream and a different direction in life. I fell in love with English literature and creative writing. And shortly before graduation, I had won a statewide creative writing competition that one of my teachers had submitted me to, and I was offered a writing scholarship at a state university. This new dream to pursue writing all came together very suddenly and unexpectedly. And it was so exciting. And I told my parents and my recruiters that I decided to take the scholarship instead of going into the military. My recruiters called my parents and told them that I would likely go to jail if I did not show up less than a month after my high school graduation, that I had already signed a contract I could not get out of. I would later learn that this was, of course, a lie. I had not signed a binding contract, but feeling like I had no other choice, in the early morning of my 18th birthday, I shipped off to basic training. 3 months later were the 9/11 attacks. 3 years later, I would find myself in Iraq, and even though I had a job that my recruiters assured me would be behind a computer screen, far from any war, I ended up doing things I spent the last 20 years grappling with. It changed the course of my life in a profound way. Let's just say my love of literature and writing did not return with me from Iraq. And I was by far one of the lucky ones. My story is far from unique. In fact, when I got to boot camp, the most common mantra was, "My recruiter lied to me." Most memorable was a group of African-American young people recruited from their high school basketball team. They were all in basic training under the belief that they had been recruited to the Army basketball team. And it was our drill sergeant who had to tell them they were not on the Army basketball team. They were, in fact, forward observers, which is the most dangerous jobs in the Army. And all of them would end up on one or more deployments to Iraq or Afghanistan, which they never expected. And I tell you these stories because I understand why many of you may want this program in your schools. It sounds great. The opportunities sound great. The opportunities sold to you by the representatives of the military. But they're selling you the same bill of goods that they sold us. They will tell you the most wonderful parts, totally omit the risks, like the greatly increased risk of sexual assault, the fact that veterans are more likely than non-veterans to be unemployed when they get out, to be homeless when they get out, the dangers on your mind and body. They have also been quite known to lie to you and to the students you're responsible for. But you have the luxury of being grown and experienced, the wisdom and maturity to do your own research, to check what you're being told. Students who are 17, 16, 15, 14, when ROTC reps will be forming these relationships with them, they do not have that same wisdom. They can be sold a fantasy just like me, and they cannot even imagine that they would be being lied to by these respectable soldiers in uniform welcomed into our schools. An investigation by the U.S. military itself determined that 1 in 5 military recruiters were found to have engaged in, quote, recruiting improprieties, from threats and coercion to false promises to young people. And the real numbers are surely much higher. And a major study conducted by the American Civil Liberties Union into recruitment practices concluded that, quote, the U.S. military's practice of targeting low-income youth and students of color in combination with exaggerated promises of financial rewards for enlistment undermines the voluntariness of their enlistment, end quote. So just came to say that the major life decision to join the military is one that should be made by adults. JROTC, despite what you are told, will enable this decision to be made by children, just like I was a child when they got me. Ultimately, this is their purpose, despite what you're told. Despite what you're told, they are recruiters. Those kids in our schools need adults to protect them, and right now you are those adults. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you to all those who came to speak today. What's the next on the agenda? Again, you're welcome to stay, or if you want to go, all good. So thank you for coming. Really appreciate your voices here.
Thank you.
Standards-based grading practices. Yeah, Ellie? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Start. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come back and engage in this conversation about equitable grading practices. As we shared earlier this fall, this initiative sits within our middle grades redesign, grades 6 through 8, for all schools. That includes our K-8s that hold our 6th through 8, and then also a really lovely partnership with our 9th through 12th grade team, led by Philippe. And so we wanted to start off by really anchoring equitable grading practices in these core shifts. We talked about this fall, but just a really brief review for anyone who wasn't a part of that earlier conversation. We talked about mathematically sound scales. That's really grounded in Doug Reeves' work, 20 years to date. It was published in December of 2004. And so really looking at that impact of a zero, the case against a zero, highlights how a student receiving a zero on a grade on a, let's call it a somewhat traditional scale, may have a huge impact, not reflecting their true knowledge base or performance on the standards. And so that's highlighted as one of those practices that needs to be discontinued, really looking at that impact of the zero. Performance standards, really clearly aligning our performance standards to the standards that we have adopted to our curriculum standards, and that being clearly communicated to our students is another key piece. You'll hear a bit more about that tonight. Rubrics, this is really unveiling for students what they need to do to perform and meet the expectations of the learning and of the teacher. And then mitigating non-academic factors. This includes things such as behavior, attendance. An example that we often use is the Kleenex box, students being asked to bring something into class for extra credit. Well, if Richard can bring 10 Kleenex boxes and my family can't afford that, he may have an inflated grade and I may not, right? So those are the things that we really want to see no longer happening, really mitigating those non-academic factors.
I have a question.
Sure.
So that really happens?
I mean, I can think of it happening in my experience as a student. Did anyone else have something like that?
Yes, it happens.
Yeah, I've seen it before.
Can I share with you an example,
Yes.
if that's okay? So I was born and raised in Belgrade, Serbia. I came to this country not speaking English, and by the time I was in high school, I was fairly proficient in English. I remember taking a very hard, it must have been an honors history class, very difficult class. And for the final exam, there was an extra credit question. And the extra credit question was, and we were all very nervous to do well in this final exam. And the extra credit question was, who stole Christmas? And all my classmates were so excited to get the answer. I had no idea. Obviously, it's a very tiny example, but extra credit is a practice that is common, was common, and to some extent perhaps still is common. This is an effort to clarify what grades are based on.
Thank you. Such a clear example. Another shift in the grading practices is really removing, it's really eliminating bias-resistant Oh, sorry, I've got ahead of myself here. We touched on that. Another piece is providing multiple opportunities to demonstrate proficiency. So this is one where sometimes when teachers first hear this, we really need to wade into this together and talk about it. Learning, it doesn't just happen in one moment, right? And so a standard may be introduced. Maybe the first time a student is assessed, they're on their way, but they're not yet proficient. But let's say they're doing a writing assessment later on, or they're doing some kind of a presentation of learning, and later on in the quarter, they then have mastered that standard. Well, our work here shows, and a big body of 2 decades of work shows, that then that grade ought to reflect the student's improved performance and knowledge of that standard. And so it doesn't mean that a teacher needs to be tasked with a lot of extra grading, but more so given permission to allow that student to keep learning throughout the quarter or semester. And then also really normalizing feedback. This is where students are giving feedback to one another, and it's really a learning environment with a growth mindset, where the teacher isn't necessarily the only one giving that feedback. It helps with that whole culture and cultural shift within the classroom of the teacher not being the only one holding that knowledge. And then really looking at, which we'll talk more about tonight, that standards-based and competency-based grading model. We've been working with neighboring districts and learning more about some great work here in our state. And then ultimately calculating grades in a way that reflects the student's final proficiency, as I already touched on. And so ultimately, as we talked about earlier this fall, if 2 students are going through 2 different classrooms and they have a similar mastery of the knowledge, our hope is that system-wide those students' grades would be similar, right, or the same. And so that's really what we're up to, and we look forward to giving you more information since we last talked about this. I'm going to turn it over to Richard and Steve.
So we have a plan that we're working through at the middle school and the high school level. There's some similarities and a few variations in that. And so we have this, I don't know if we have extra copies to pass around, if we already did. Kind of a quick little one-pager that goes through what our 3-year plan is around getting this implemented in schools. And some of that's beginning very quickly here. And so we are going to be, teachers are receiving a survey this week to see if they're interested in being part of a team that will come together to review pre-existing learning targets and to revise those and make sure they're aligned. And then once we have those done in February, that's the plan, then we're going to move into soliciting a pilot group for next school year for math and English language arts in the middle grade levels. And that pilot group is going to take those targets that we created, and they're going to roll those out system-wide and then give feedback and edit and revise as needed for a final rollout in the 25-26 school year for all teachers across 6A. And that's kind of where we're going for the middle grades.
I'll talk about high school, so.
Okay. And then if you look at the state of our district around, different schools are doing different grading systems. There's some that are completely doing this model already. The 4 that we know of are Hosford Middle School, Kellogg Middle School, Mount Tabor Middle School, and Vernon, which is a K-8. And then within those schools, some teachers are partially or fully implementing in other schools. So when I met with all 28 K-8 and 6A principals over the summer and I asked them about this, every single one of them said they had some teachers that were doing it at their school. Some had more, some had less. It was quite all over the place with that. And so then I'll turn over where high school is.
Sure. At the high school level, the important thing to remember, as I think is the case for middle schools as well, is that much of this work has been underway for many years. Different teachers have participated in professional development, whether it was called proficiency-based grading or standards-based grading or grading for equity. These are different iterations of some common educational principles that have some variation between each other, but in many cases share some similarities. So all high schools use standards-based equitable grading practices to some extent. We have some high schools that have full departments that are fully aligned. Other high schools have particular teachers who are implementing these practices. In a recent conversation with high school principals, they all expressed deep support and interest in wanting to continue supporting implementation of these practices, and are interested in gaining some clarity around some contractual language and to what extent we as a school district can set parameters for what grading practices should include. And our assessment is that absolutely we ought to set those parameters in the same way that we set parameters around what is the adopted curriculum and the extent to which it is standards-based, that we want our grading practices to be standard-based as well. And so moving forward, if we go to the next slide, similar to, one resource that we wanted to share is that earlier this fall, Beaverton School District, for anybody who's interested, there's a brief video that they shared with their families, which is linked here. Does a wonderful job of summarizing in student-friendly and family-friendly language what standards-based equitable grading practices are and what families can expect to see in their from their teachers and in their schools with regards to how their students will be assessed. So we're in the process of finalizing an implementation plan. This work will include identifying learning standards for each content area. We definitely want to lean on our teachers as experts who, again, have engaged in this work and will be important assets in this project. The hope is that next school year we begin small pilots where groups of teachers are implementing and using standards-based grade books that throughout the year they will provide us with some feedback around so that we can fine-tune those grade books. And the hope is that we have a more complete rollout the following school year.
Thank you. A couple questions, but first, so I've actually used proficiency-based grading for good on 10 years probably, 8 of those years in PPS. So I know personally that a lot of teachers are already using it, or at least a hybrid of some, and so I'm hoping that would help the rollout, because there's one thing when it naturally grows among teachers, just because it's best practices, right? But then having a district try to unify it, right, is another challenge. So I'm just curious about if you could talk more about how we are supporting our teachers to help try to unify and create a more standard system. So again, one of the just kind of back up a little bit, right? One of the 3 big goals of proficiency-based grading, right, is that number one, we're trying to get away from students worrying about grades and they're worried more about learning. You focus on learning, not on just getting the grade, right? Number 2, like you said before, every kid grows at a different rate, so they may get a 0 in the first assessment, but if all of a sudden they're doing all their trigonomic functions by on this second semester as everyone else, they should have the same grade as everyone else, right? Everyone learns at a different rate. And then number 3, it's clear to the students what is expected of them, right? And that's where you talk about rubrics and stuff like that. So I feel like that. I just want to rephrase that. That's kind of am I missing anything? Like that's kind of the big picture goal of proficiency-based grading, right? I don't know if that helps.
You've identified the big pieces, absolutely.
Right. So now the question is, one of the big problems with grading in general is that if every teacher has a different system, the students are spending more time navigating how the teachers grade than learning, right? And so the same thing can happen, I think, with proficiency. If every teacher has different ways of doing proficiency grading, they're still spending time navigating different systems, right? So I guess the question is like what kind of vision do you have? I'm talking more about vision because I know this is still piloting and all that stuff, about how we're supporting our teachers so that we can have, just make it easier on everyone, especially our students.
Before I jump in, I just want to invite Margaret Calvert, who is a teacher, principal, has been in the district for a long time, has seen this work. Anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big piece that where I think Director Long you're getting at is grading is about communication, right? Like that's the fundamental purpose of it. And with that, then it's tied to so clarity is important, as is the quality of the questions that it solicits answers from students to demonstrate their learning. So I think that what I would say we experienced coming through the pandemic when students weren't physically in front of teachers is how do we know what kids know in this moment? So they started to think about not only how do they grade and communicate progress, right? But also what are the assessments? So grading and assessment and effective and balanced assessment is intertwined. And so what you're describing is, I can have a standards-based report card, right, that we see in elementary, but it's what is the work that the students are producing that leads to that mark, right? So you can get more fine-tuned instead of it being on a 4-point scale that you're saying, I'm standard one on if I use a math standard around systems of linear equations, I can solve system of linear equations by graphing, right? If that's the standard, the question is how are we assessing and what are the students' opportunities? So this is where you get back to proficiency and sufficiency. How many times do you have to demonstrate it? Where do you demonstrate it? So this is where you start to get this conversation so quickly into how are we actually assessing students, or if we go, that's kind of old school in some ways, but just asking students to demonstrate their learning and their understanding. So is it formative? Is it summative? We've done a variety of work, everything from Doug Reeves to Ken O'Connor to Joe Feldman to Rick Stiggins to a variety of other folks. But the question ultimately is, are we well versed in asking the questions and the ways and the opportunities for students to demonstrate their understanding? And then that gets connected to the work that we're doing, a lot of the work that we're doing around professional learning communities. So where are the opportunities for teachers to say, here's a body of work the students are producing. How is that informing our practice? And how do we communicate that back to students and families about their progress? So I think ultimately, it's this is like the heart of what teaching and learning is, right? And so we can get stuck in the technical, like what is the rubric, what is the score on the scale, but ultimately it's about communication, right? Like this is what we want students to learn, and this is what it looks like, so that students can not only can educators assess the students or families look at it, but the kids can do it themselves. Like, oh, this is where I am relative to the progression. So ultimately that will be the goal on how do you get teachers talking with each other and supporting each other in that work. Within buildings, often it's through content areas at the secondary level, but then how do you, when you're looking at how does that look the same or different in performance-based classes like dance versus math, right? Like, so there's some of those nuances that will continue to grow and develop. But the general thing of how are we communicating, I think that certainly coming out of the pandemic, this was a critical piece that, everyone was really wrestling with coming out of education, at that time.
So there is going to be PLC time devoted for this, for teachers to work together to share and collaborate on. Because I know in the early days of proficiency-based grading, when not many of us were doing it, it was a huge asset to be able to work with other teachers and be like, oh yeah, these ideas, oh wow, that was way more efficient than what I'm doing here, right?
And then it's that looking at student work together, right? So like, what do you see in what is being produced? And then what's the next step in the student learning, right? So those conversations are critical to supporting not only the teachers and educators with each other, but then with the students.
And that calls into question also the use of rubrics. You do have to have standardized rubrics in order for that to work. And then you do need to use the rubric as an instructional tool. So students know exactly what it is they need to be able to obtain mastery of to make some progression. Because there are times that students do want the 4.0, and there are times they just don't want to exert themselves that much. But every student does have a right to know what it's going to take to attain whatever goal they want. The other piece of that, which I continually stress, is knowing the students that are in front of you and the students that you're going to be using the rubrics for. Because depending on who they are, they might be able to demonstrate deeper learning with less versus the student who can do the whole thing, right? So you've got to look at language proficiency, you've got to look at cognitive ability, and you've also got to look at your continuum and the length of time it's going to take them to attain that mastery. But it's all driven by a standardized rubric that everybody's agreed to. In language arts, for example, you could have a 6-point rubric or you could have a 4-point rubric. But each of those descriptors explains clearly what a student needs to demonstrate in their writing to be able to earn the points in that category. So how do you exemplify that through your work? And how does somebody else look at it and say, yes, it does merit the score? Because it has to be objective and not subjective.
So everybody looking at it, see the same thing.
Yes.
And also a step-by-step in the rubric.
Yes.
Interesting that also like the talk about standardized rubric, because one thing that could save teachers a lot of time and energy too is that having a like standardized goals for, right? So like if you're an algebra 2 teacher and your kids are coming from 2-3 different algebra 1 teachers, they're coming in with the same set of knowledge instead of having to differentiate from day one. So I think that there's a benefit of that. I just want to welcome, I saw Director Green is up there, and I know we didn't say hi to JJ earlier. I don't know if you two have any questions or want to say hi or
I'd love to say hello.
tell us a joke or something like that.
I have no
It's a
jokes
good
to
one.
tell you outside of I thought we moved.
You see, Director Green's giving us a good one, but we can't hear it. Come on,
Yeah.
Director Green.
Teach us how to lip read.
Can y'all hear me now?
Right, we're just working on it.
Oh, we're working on it.
There we go.
Oh, now we hear you.
Okay, there we go. So I made the mistake of gutting my upstairs bathroom and forgetting that we had this this meeting tonight because my daughter started complaining about her light not working and the lighting wasn't right, and that's why she was using my bathroom. So I started gutting it, and so that's why I'm not there tonight. I apologize. And I for whatever the reason, I had the 11th on my mind, and so I spaced it, and for that I apologize.
Yeah,
That might have been my fault. I think I was talking to you about the 11th at some point, so I'll take part of that blame. But I have another bathroom if you want to gut another. You can go at it if you want.
There's a whole measure of proficiency we can talk about at that as well.
Right, does the bathroom work?
Step by step. And you usually have to demonstrate it multiple times, so,
Right.
Definitely want to hit mastery.
Yeah. And that's the other point about proficiency is like that's how the world works, right? Can you fly the plane or not? Right? So I mean that's how the world grades you, and same thing here. Can you do trigonometry or find the area of a circle or not? I mean, yeah. Anyways.
The other piece that, again, this is already happening to varying degrees, but for students who don't demonstrate proficiency by the end of, let's say, the first semester, and they go into second semester, I remember the days when those students had to retake the whole class in the summer, right? And whoever was teaching them in the summer actually had no idea what were their learning gaps, because there were no systems in place to actually understand what learning targets did the student master, what learning targets did they not master. And so in our schools, we already have schools and teachers and systems where we're becoming increasingly more nuanced in understanding, well, what is the completion that needs to happen? What is the learning that still needs to happen? And then we kind of create opportunities for students to complete that credit or recover that credit. This would allow us to really take those efforts to another level and become even more clear with our students and with our staff, how to best support students who need additional time and additional resources, and to be more targeted around those supports. Whereas before, the grade was simply kind of a composite of a lot of things. tests, homework, extra credit, chapter 5. And like you said, it wasn't about specifically what is the learning that students need to demonstrate. So that's another exciting, I think, feature of this mission.
What is in place to actually help people get to that place if they're not making it? That's what always seems to be a problem.
Are you talking about teachers or students?
For students?
Well, both, I guess. Well, more I'm talking about students. If you have a system in place that is taking a step-by-step rubric and this person is not making it, is there actual help for that student? I mean,
I'll give you a high school
always talk
example.
about helping, and then it doesn't seem to
So
happen.
we, at the high school level, twice a month, we have what are called flex periods. These are tutorial opportunities for students to access more kind of individual time with their teachers. And we have schools and we have departments that come together and they decide as a team which teacher is going to be reteaching which learning targets. They communicate to students, hey, if you need to work on this learning target, go to this room. If you need more help with this learning target, you go to see this teacher, right? So we're able to, again, just be much more intentional about how we support students. And this is not necessarily students who didn't earn a passing grade by the end of the semester. This is ongoing, right? This, by the end of this week or by the end of this unit, these are some points of confusion. We can organize our supports around learning targets much more intentionally if we're clear what are we trying to get students to be able to do or to know.
The good thing about that too is you can also create a portfolio system where the student can reflect on how many tries or attempts it took them to get from the initial attempt to what we consider to be proficient. And as time goes on, maybe they can reduce the number of tries and efforts. The beauty about that is that it encourages the student to continue to persevere, because we do need children who can persevere, who have the stamina and the grit to at least stay with the more challenging task until it's done. And the portfolio at the end of the year just goes with them from one grade level to the next. It's a foundation of success in the past grade level, and also very helpful towards ensuring their self-esteem.
Just a comment on one thing you said earlier. I think one thing I did hear from students, especially from a few of the DSC reps, was that they were wanting more flex time, right? More access to teachers because it was such a valuable time. So that's good. The other thing, and then I'll call on JJ. I see his hands up. And one more thing is well, I'll ask this. This is a bigger question, so I'll wait till I'll ask. I'm calling JJ first, and then I'll ask this question.
Okay, hi everyone. Hope everyone's having a good day. So I was just wondering, is the plan to essentially like kind of equalize the grading system across the school district? And then my next question was, how does this directly benefit students?
It's a great one. I think speaking to the middle grades, and I'll pass it to Felipe in a second. This really sits within the middle grades redesign plan, and so as Richard emphasized earlier, really this year is organizing those teacher leaders. You touched on this before. Some teachers already are really utilizing this and are very comfortable, and will be a tremendous part of the work this year in defining those standards and shaping the grade book and moving forward. And we want that to build success. Success builds success. And then we have train-the-trainers model to lean upon within the schools. To just touch on JJ's question, I love that. How will this benefit students? I feel like I could talk for a really long time on that. And I'll flip it and say, I don't know how it doesn't. I think it brings the clarity of the rubric of knowing what you're aiming for, what's the standard, what is my teacher asking me to learn. It's that checkpoint of, did I learn the material I needed to? If I didn't, what standards do I need to continue to work on? Where do I go during flight time, or how can I go back and continue my unfinished learning? I also just, elevate that example again of two students in two different classrooms with a similar understanding of material potentially getting drastically different grades, potentially, right? So this removes that potential where our hope would be that if two students in the same class or the district are both mastering material, that their grades would reflect that fully. And so just ensures that system.
And JJ, anecdotally, I've been in a lot of classrooms that do this, and the language of the students is so different when they talk about the assignment, what they're working on. They talk about proficiency. They talk about this is what I need to do. They know very specifically what metrics they need to do to get there. Not just, oh, I need to get it in on time or something along that lines. It's very, very specific.
And then to add one more thing, one of the things I've seen when seeing teachers teach proficiency-based grading is engagement, and especially not losing engagement. Like, for example, if a kid doesn't do well first quarter and gets a 0 on something, and they do the math, they calculate, oh yeah, there's no way I can ever get above an F or a D, then they just start disengaging and whatnot. But if you have proficiency-based system, what happens is if you prove an proficiency on something, all your past scores on that don't count, because you already shown that you can fly an airplane, right? That's your grade. So what happens is that you have less students that basically disengage from class because they know that it's about the learning, not about something arbitrary, right? Like whether the teacher likes your writing style. It's a very clear goal, and it creates more independence with students because then they have rubrics that they can rely on and see, like, these are the things I need to achieve.
What it also seems really good to me is that you don't get behind. Like, I can remember taking some math courses that I could keep pretending I knew it, but it kept getting harder and harder, and then you don't know it finally. So if you really are sure you know that step before you go to the next step, then you're going to learn. Otherwise, you're just going to probably get a C maybe out of the class, but you don't really know it. So this sounds really, really good to me as someone who stumbled with that. I would have loved to have been stopped and gone to that flex class and really know what to do before the next.
Well, I think that, part of, back to JJ's question about sort of, we're part of, so we talked about communication, grading is about communication, and so how specific and actionable is the feedback that you're giving students about what their next step is really critical. And we talk a lot about creating independent, less dependent learners and saying, how can I assess my own learning? Where am I? Here are the things that we're working towards. Which of them am I confident in? Which are the areas I need to focus? It helps students ask better questions and engage, and it makes a reciprocal engagement and relationship with the teacher in the classroom. I think the part that I've also heard, and so one of the things that we need to work through as well, when we're talking about getting behind, is, when there's multiple entry points, the question is, do you actually get stuff done? You know what I mean? So it's like, how do you help pace students so that they can see where they are in the body of work that they're doing, and that we want multiple entry points, and we also want students demonstrating understanding, right? And so I think that's a common tension point in any secondary classroom of how do you keep welcoming folks in and saying, that essay needs to actually get finished. And so, or that we're gonna take one more run at it, and then, this is the goal. So I think, one of the pieces where we've seen people really go through, I think JJ, to your point, is there are nuances that are different across classrooms, often, and again, it's going to be tied to assessment. What are the questions that are being asked, and how are students demonstrating their learning? But you're going to want there to be a frame, right? So there's some predictability about what the experience is going to be. It may not be uniform, right? But there will be some predictability that we should be able to speak to, not only, within a specific classroom, but then across classrooms. And that requires a lot of calibration and work and collaboration for people to get on the same page about what does that mean. I mean, I think probably, Director Long, you're teaching the SimCam days. right? Where we would go and you'd have a stack of student tasks, and you would put teachers around a table and say, okay, did the student demonstrate understanding, and how do you know, and what's the score and the rubric? And you had to calibrate with each other
Right. A
to
lot of
develop
blurry
that
memories about
understanding,
that.
right? And so there's a part of it that is done like, okay, we're gonna build this out, but really the key is getting engagement and doing it as a group, right? Whether it's building out the standards and agreeing to the work, to which ones we're gonna highlight, or, you know, this is how, we agree that this is meets the criteria, right? And so I think that that's also something that's really hopeful about the work, is it provides all these entry points into meaningful collaboration for staff and students.
JJ?
Yeah, I was wondering when you guys were making the equitable grading practices, I was wondering what did the student engagement and involvement look like?
This project's been going on for like almost 10 years, right? Yeah, good question.
So I mean, I think it's come in a couple of ways, JJ. One is at individual school sites. There have been work that has happened with teacher teams and students and families around understanding what does that look like. What's a little different, I think, from like the video that Beaverton created, that like one of the big shifts is about how do students demonstrate, and is it participation, right, and sort of active engagement, or is it demonstrating understanding? And tends to be a place where we're engaging students and talking about what does that mean. Like often you'll hear students or like, we're not going to grade homework, right? Like may not, because we're going to demonstrate proficiency. And so like there's this tension point of like, what does that mean exactly? From as a student, what are you asking me to do? And are you not grading everything I produce, right? And so I think that that's probably the place that as we work with students has been like, how do we create that understanding of getting feedback? You receive feedback frequently, that things may be graded less frequently, right? And so this is where I think we can lean heavily on our performance-based classrooms, where if you're in a dance classroom, for example, the verbal feedback that is happening on the regular basis in that classroom is constant, almost, of small adjustments. But then where do they get sort of the formal grading is much more spaced out. And I think that that's kind of like, how do we get that feedback, balance that feedback, and help kids progress is really a critical thing. And that's part of the engagement. And this particular thing, it has not happened broadly across the district. There have been pockets of spaces where it's been during textbook adoptions that has happened, where there's been some conversation about assessments. Science has done some, both at the middle school and high school. And then math has probably done it the most in various places across the district. You also see it at IB schools, where they often are very rubric-based and standards-based, and so there is engagement. So it's, what I would say is different is that we're saying, how do we do this and engage across the system and not in pockets? So how do we connect the dots to make it seem more systematic?
It does require that our educators have a very deep knowledge and understanding of standards, because the standards are going to require that you design performance tasks that will allow students to attain those goals. We try not to give busy work, because sometimes busy work can be very frustrating. And we try not to give work that will not be graded, because then you send a message by default that the work that students are doing, you know, some of it is important, others are not. But in order for us to truly work on proficiency grading systems well, we do have to, as a collective, understand the standards beyond the superficial level, you know, and then understand the different ways, a variety of ways that students can demonstrate an understanding of that standard and apply it. So how do we design these performance tasks? Right?
And I would say, you know, it's been woven in a little bit into the instructional framework. So we did have students involved with the instructional framework and the development, and not only with you know, teachers and not only educators from a variety of stances, but then also we've done some outreach with families and with Students, I don't know, I mean, JJ, your point is well taken. We can always do a better job with students. And I think, given how central this is to their experience, engaging early and often is helpful.
Remember, like from my experience with the student, I mean, I don't know if this sort of addresses your question, JJ, as well. A lot of teachers are using some form of proficiency-based grading, but I remember the feedback from students has always been overwhelmingly positive and great, because they realize it's about the learning and not about trying to figure out how your teacher grades, right?
Yep.
In fact, the most interesting thing is the biggest resistance among students tends to come from like the 4.5 GPA straight A students, right? Because they're like, I already figured out how to work the system, and now you're requiring me to actually learn something. It was always an interesting conversation, and I always thought that was like interesting that was where like the biggest resistance. Which kind of leads me to the next thing I was going to ask. There's some known hurdles, right? Like for example, you mentioned I saw it in your one pager here, which is great. Implement changes to gradebooks based on feedback. I mean, one hurdle that I've heard from a lot of teachers is that trying to figure out how to get synergy, right?
Yeah.
To work with proficiency grading. So I don't know if you're able to speak to some work being done on that and supports being created?
And that's a little bit of what I think the experience has been for a lot of teachers is getting excited about an approach to grading and assessing that aligns with their beliefs, that is research-based, that is effective, and then unable to figure out how do I do this in the system that we are using, right? And so that's a little bit of the work that we will do centrally to help facilitate, is to work with our Synergy team, work with our Canvas teams to create grade books that actually allow for this work to happen with heavy input, participation, and feedback from our teachers. So there are kind of a few different parallel projects happening at once, but the grade book integration is absolutely critical. That's not the only thing that needs to happen. I think continuing professional development, continuing the learning, continuing the engaging with students and teachers, absolutely. But there is a technical component that we just need to make sure is there so that teachers can do the work in the system that we have.
That's good. So it's being worked on.
Yes.
That's the big message that would resonate well with people.
And again, the hope is that by the end of that we have teams of teachers informing the design of those grade books this spring, that we have a group of teachers piloting throughout next year, providing feedback, fine-tuning, and then scaling it up even more the following school year.
Director Green has his.
Yeah, go for it. Sorry to see it.
No, no worries at all. Just want to, I guess I'm curious as to, and I don't know if this is the right place to be asking this question or how it ties in exactly, but I've been looking at the data that we just received, and how our kids are currently doing. And according to the data, a lot of our kids are not reading at the right level. They're not, their math scores are not at the right level. So we have kids in high school that have middle school reading levels. So I'm really curious to, and maybe I missed it because I came on late, but I guess what I'm trying to understand is, in light of our scores that we just received, showing that a large number of our students of color are not showing proficiency in reading and writing and math, as a lot of other students, that they're not at the current grade level as they should be. How does what we're doing now get those kids closer to where they actually need to be?
start off with, I think this is a really big and deep question, and I think the first piece is clearly communicating where students are at, going back to what Mark Halbert was sharing earlier, that grades are communication. And when we've been engaging with our teacher professional learning and we've been talking with teachers and they're calibrating around how students are doing, the first thing we need to do is have that rubric where we're seeing where students are at, and then clearly communicating to our students how they're progressing. When they're not progressing and we're clear on where they're not progressing, that's when our first line defense of our tier 1 instruction is not working, and we're able to see that because we're assessing directly on those standards, that's where we can be even more intentional in all of our efforts. And so there is a lot of synergy in a lot of our other initiatives that we have underway. So I'll start with that piece of it, and there's a lot more to it. But that's what comes to mind for me, is clearly communicating where students are at in relation to that standard, opposed to what could happen right now is students could be assessed on things other than that standard in grading practices that are not fully equitable. And so we may not see clearly where the student is at in relation to the standards in the grade. We do on our other assessments, but we may not in the grade consistently.
I just want to add that reading is thinking, right? And reading is also comprehension. But in order for children to get better, students to get better at reading, the only other way is to read, and to read a lot. But the art of reading has to be strategically taught and explicitly taught also. Because we're going to have to teach kids how to interact with text, how to interact cognitively, and how to also blend the different pieces of input that they're getting from what they're reading. But that has to be modeled. That has to be modeled by the classroom teacher. It has to be modeled by peers. They have to have opportunities to deduce meaning from text, because that is what SBAC is actually asking them to do, to look at pieces of information, to get feedback, to get input, and to come up with their own reasoning supported by evidence. All of that has to be explicitly taught. So if our students are not, especially students of color, if they are not doing well on the standardized tests, we need to go back and see what the practice is around instruction and what the opportunities are for students to demonstrate thinking and understanding in light of the level of comprehension they need to attain their goals.
Sounds like a little bit of what you're hinting at is also that if we haven't, this was implemented fully, right? Idealistically, right? That when we have a proficiency-based grading system and the grade book reflects that and everything, in that if a student has cracks in their knowledge, it's easier to identify and do and assign remedial work. You mentioned that sort of the summer program where the ideal is that you have proficiencies and that's handed over to the next teacher. They can see exactly where this kid is succeeding and struggling, right?
It's different from seeing unit 2 was a 80 or a 50, right? Versus it was linear equations and they were good at finding the slope from 2 points, but not from reading and interpreting from a graph. So you could, the level of intervention and support, the level of specificity is greater, I think, Director Green, which then provides a path to, if this is where the learning is where we want the students to be, but this is where they are, it provides a path to getting there that is something that the students can see a little more explicitly. I think that again, what I would say is that as we're working to build collaborative practices that build more consistency across classrooms and across buildings, that's the ultimate goal, right? And I think that Senior Director Tobin said that around, what you're looking for is consistency from classroom to classroom, and that if it happens here, that we say that this is what it looks like to to understand or demonstrate understanding of linear equations, or proportional reasoning, or a personal narrative, or an expository piece of writing. So we'll go even further and say, what does that look like in music, and what does that look like in social studies, and that's the part where you have to, it takes a lot of people to build out that consensus in order to then get to the specificity that allows that to shift over time. And so I think, I think that there are some strong foundational pieces that we're seeing from our curricular adoptions in particular. I think that there has been some agreement and consensus building around some of our performance classes that we can then learn from and build out. But again, the key is to not have this be in pockets, but to make it be a system that is connected and not that there's pockets of excellence. And so I think that that's something we continue to strive towards, and to say, in order to do that, we need to look at where things are working and what does that look like and what are those steps. So when we accelerate student learning, that's the goal. You accelerate early, often, and persistently in order to keep students achieving. And I think that's within the school day, outside the school day, outside the school year. And so I think this is a piece of a larger puzzle that helps us get there. But so there are some of these foundational pieces with instructional framework, the curriculum adoptions, the looking at our assessments and our balanced assessment calendar. These start to get us in the space of like, okay, here's the game plan, and we're all playing from the same game plan. So that's been the goal, and we're getting there, but there's work to do, as you state, Director. There's work to do.
Yeah, I just happened to read an article today in OSBA News, and the title was "Grades Don't Always Relate to Being on Grade Level." And this was talking, of course, more about primary, I think, but that parents need to know where they really are, what the test scores really are, not, they're advancing, or maybe a fourth grader is actually on grade level of second grade, so you give them a B because they're making progress. And the article pretty much said we need to know where students really are, and parents need to know about achievement tests and need to help to know what the resources are. Now, probably not so much in high school, but certainly in primary. And
at all levels,
it goes even more
It
exactly with
just
what you're
gets
saying. Where should you be? If you're not there, what do you need?
How can we locate your understanding, right?
Yeah, right.
And ideally, how can the student locate themselves?
Right. I have something to add, but I think there was a question in the back. Or
Yeah, I'm a freshman. I apologize. It's been a minute since I've been to any of these kinds of meetings. I'm at least 2 decades out. Decade for sure. I haven't been to this specific student success meeting. I kind of went to the main ones, but I hadn't attended the back. And actually, I remember you could have said it. But I'm trying to gain an understanding or re-understanding of this is a student success meeting, so recognizing there's one specific thing on the agenda that was being talked about today. And what I thought I heard Director Green ask was a practical question, but it kind of seemed like he got a conceptual answer. So I'm just wondering, like, maybe this isn't the space, maybe this is a follow-up meeting that's gonna happen at some point in the future, and I'll definitely come back to that too. But looking for like practical steps, like based on those reports that just came in, is there a target? Is there a way that we can know what schools those students come from? And then there can be absolute immediate action to help address those populations of students. Like, because I understand this is, from what I'm hearing, this is under construction. It's something that's coming in the future. We're all, yay, it's going to be beautiful. But like right here where we are right now, how do we beautify the situation currently for these students specifically?
So that's why I was saying that reading is thinking,
Absolutely.
right? And that the only way to get better at reading is to read.
Yes.
But in order to apply the strategies around reading, those have to be explicitly taught and modeled. And then the student has to be given the opportunity to actually practice. Exactly. That's where the equitable grading practices come in and performance tasks. So it does sound like a conceptual answer, but no, that's what we actually need to do. To say, if I can't make meaning from this text, what is it that's stripping me up? It could be the vocabulary pieces, it could be lack of a context, it could be lack of the schema or the ability to comprehend. So all those things the teacher has to know. to be able to adequately plan, break it down and teach it in chunks.
Yeah,
Right.
1,000%, but I guess what I'm asking is, for those students
Right now.
right now that are that produce that specific report,
Mhm.
how do we take exactly what you say and implement it immediately?
Right.
So that they don't fall through the cracks while we're building this beautiful new machine.
Right, so what we have to do is look at that data, look at who those students are, like you originally said, figure out their schools, their teachers, and then provide the supports that they need along the lines of what I just said. To say, all right, if they don't understand this, what do we need to do to help them understand it? Do we need to use shorter text? Do we need to use a different schema? Do we need to introduce the materials in a different way?
And I guess what I'm saying is, I am willing to help be a part of the boots on the ground. Give me the list. Let's go do that.
Right.
So if there's a meeting that's gonna help make that happen, and I will bring people with me.
Okay. Thank you, thank you for.
And I think, I hope you're saying that that's what our teachers are doing. I mean, they are looking at our students and they're saying, this person needs more help with phonics. So I'm going to give them more help, or I'm going to bring in I'm a primary teacher, so I'm bringing in a parent to help with that or something. And are we doing that? Do we have the personnel to do it?
We do have the personnel to do it, and we're doing it to varying degrees and to varying degrees of success. So what we need to do is just amp that up, and do more of it, and do more of it even more explicitly.
And how? I mean, more
Well,
people?
if you get a list, so if you get, let's assume that I do have a second grade class, right, which is low primary, and I get a list of students who are not doing well. My first responsibility is to look to see who those students are. Are they my second language learners? Are they my special ed students? Or are they my tag students? Because sometimes you do have tag students who basically don't do well also, right? Who are the students? And then what areas do they struggle with? Because you find kids who have no problem reading narrative text, but then once you take them into maybe a different type of text, an expository text, a persuasive text, an argumentative text, then the skill sets that they bring into that knowledge does not quite work, because you don't necessarily read those varieties the same way, which means now the teacher has to break that down and help them understand, yes, this is a narrative, but here's the difference between a narrative text and a persuasive text, and a persuasive text and an argumentative. You see what I'm saying? You have to know the genre in which the kids need to read and understand, and then you have to be able to break that genre down and teach that to kids, and then give them the opportunity to practice it, to lead to mastery of being able to read that level of text. There are kids who love graphic novels, and there are kids who get lost in graphic novels because the graphic novels trip them up, right? So there is a different skill set that the child needs to be able to use. What we have to do as educators is expose them to so many different texts, variety of text, complexity of text, different genres, so they know the characteristic of a genre. What I found in working in San Diego, my kids were failing, right? So what I found was that many times they just did not quite understand the characteristic of a genre. So they get a question around persuasive text, right? But they use the narrative schema that they have to respond to it. Well, it's not going to quite work, right? Because there are pieces of language that is specific to narrative and also specific to persuasive. So we had to teach them to identify those right from the onset and to try to figure out exactly what it is they're being asked to look at, argue, or persuade about, which means we had to teach it. So we had 6-week chunks of time that we picked out the genres that were specific, right, the broader genres that we deal with, and then taught those. Right, informational writing is another piece. Descriptive writing is another piece. You don't necessarily approach them the same way. They're not written the same way. They're not, taught the same way, and the skill sets and characteristics different.
But I think what you're asking and what Director Green are asking is, what about the ones who don't, with all that you're doing, that they need the extra help, they're not getting.
So yeah, I can give a real example from my experience. hopefully this answered both your questions, but like for 18 years I taught ninth grade science. Ninth grade science is difficult because it's usually biology, but now it's physics, which is great. These kids come in from middle school, which means I don't have their grades. And it was just like a crapshoot of how to target these kids and what to do. I remember sometimes when I would get, I treated it like gold, a progress report from their middle school teachers, their eighth grade teachers. And it was just like, now I can target exactly what this kid needs. Like I remember there was one kid, and science uses a lot of math, right? I remember I had one kid who came in, and the middle school teacher just, out of the goodness of their heart, emailed me. I was like, this kid, can add, subtract, multiply, but it really struggles with division, and that's holding this kid back. And I remember just, during flex time, bring this kid in, be like, we're on division. I'm teaching math and science, right, and stuff like that, and really target. And these kind of practices help prevent kids from falling through cracks. Because if this deficiency was never identified, who knows? They could have failed a class and then just decide school was not good, and then, like I said, fall through the cracks, right? But because it was, like that's why I treat it like gold. And I think the dream is that one of the issues is like, proficiency-based grading it started like 10, 12 years ago. 25 years ago, and it's been shown to be best practices and doing better and stuff like that. And I think the dream is that if we can unify that, then every teacher can have, especially if we fix the gradebook issue, right? I can look up every student's gradebooks and be like, oh, this is where their holes are, and target, so that we're not, it's one thing to get a kid to come in your class who has a D from a previous class, and you have no idea what that means, right? It's another thing to be like, oh, they're good at this and this, but they're really struggling at this and division. And now I know how to help the kid, right? And so I think that's kind of like a specific example of like, where the dream is, right? Where the ultimate goal is. If we can unify this and everyone's using it, then we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel every year, save everyone a lot of time. I don't know if that helps or not, but that's where I'm hoping we're going. But yeah. Another really difficult question. How does this relate to grading? I'll give you a very specific example again. So like, one things I struggled when I was doing proficiency-based grading is if they get all these proficiencies, what grade do I give them at the end? Because that's the system we work in, unfortunately. I'm not a big fan of ABCs and Ds or Fs. But like I'll give you a real example. Like for example, one thing that when I worked through Synergy, I always had to have a last column that was called something like
total.
No, yeah, no, it wasn't total. It was just like weighted teacher assessment. And what I meant by that was like, let's say I got a kid that came into school, into my ninth grade class, who, let's say I taught reading. I'm just giving just an arbitrary example, who reads at a ninth grade level, and by the end of ninth grade, you should read at 10th grade level, right? So they go from a ninth grade level reading to a 10th grade level reading. They proficient, they get an A, right? But let's say I get another kid that comes in who is reading at a 5th grade level. And then they work their butts off all year, and then they end the year at reading at a 9th grade level. Well, this kid just jumped 4 grade levels in reading, but based on proficiency, they fail because they're not at a 10th grade reading, right? And so my question is, this is like what we struggle with is like proficiency grading plus, right? Where to go from this? So like a growth mentality. Do we weight growth as part of the grade as well? Or, like how are you assisting teachers who are struggling with this very thing? Like how does proficiency go to grades? Yes. I know that Director Green, you have your hand up as well. I don't know if you want to ask first or wait to hear an answer first.
I'm sorry, was that for me?
Yeah. I don't know if you had a question or you want to answer or.
No, I do have a question. So Dr. O earlier was mentioning some things that I'd like to get a little bit more on. I heard her say something about she said that, and I could be missing this wrong because I was trying to take notes as she was talking, because I'm trying to see how this all fits. But she mentioned that there are several different genres that kids need to be taught from. So my question is, what genres are we actually using, and or what genres are the students exposed to, if that's the case? Because I heard her say something about genres, and when I think genres, I think something different. But okay, I like the way that she put it. And then what are we doing? What are we doing so that how do these students get to show that they've mastered that genre? You know what I mean? Like I know what I hear what she's saying. It sounds good. I don't understand it from a layman's term. So I'm trying to get layman's term, like from a 5th grade perspective. What genres are we teaching, or what genres are they being exposed to? How are they teaching them? When did they get to practice a level of mastery for those things? And so on. So I'm really trying to understand, because the data is not nice. And I heard somebody, we were talking about the data earlier, and we were saying stuff like, well, the schools need to get it. When we went over the data, we were looking at a holistic platter of the data. Each individual school received data for their specific school. So it's not a question of, do the schools know this about their schools, about their classrooms, about their teachers? Because the reality is they do. We got a broad spectrum. They got an individual school spectrum. So they know which students in their schools aren't doing well. They know how many students in their school aren't reading at grade level. They know how many students in their school aren't showing proficiency in math. They know this. My question is, and what I'm trying to get to is, and I heard Dr. Calvert said earlier, is that, are we making sure that across the board systematically everybody is doing the same thing? That every teacher is teaching to make sure that every student that leaves their classroom can read, that every student that leaves their classroom can do math, is showing proficiency in math at the appropriate grade level. This is basic information. Before this student leaves my class, they will be at this level, and I'm doing everything in my sphere of influence to make sure that this happens, whether that be teach at a genre or whether that be do something else. I don't care what you need to do. You signed up to be an educator. It's your job to figure out what you need to do. But it's to make sure that every student that leaves is leaving at the appropriate level. Because we can't continue to pass kids simply because they got bigger. And that's what we're doing. We're passing kids, we're moving kids forward simply because they outgrew a seat, and we're moving them to the next, say, hey, well, it's out of my class. Well, the next teacher has to deal with it. Well, it's out of my hands. I'm gonna push them to the 3rd grade, and now that teacher can deal with it. Oh, it's out of my hands. I'm gonna push to y'all. Y'all see what I'm saying? This becomes a perpetual issue, and it's impacting people of color in an extremely negative manner. So I'm hearing what we're talking about. I guess what I want to know is, how is what we're talking about going to minimize kids going from one grade level to the next grade level unable to read and do math? That's it.
I can try to dive in and tackle that a little bit, and feel free to jump in as well. A lot of what we're doing right now is trying this curriculum adoption where there's standards, where there's metrics that students are supposed to rise to, but we don't necessarily have a grade book that reflects that right now. So students aren't getting the information they need, parents aren't getting the information they need to be able to know what they're mastering, what they're proficient in, what they're not proficient in. One of our purposes of our teacher meetings, our professional learning communities, is for them to unpack those standards, and with standards-based grading, that is what they'll primarily be doing in those things, is that unit unpacking, looking at what students are supposed to know specifically and getting down to the rubric of what does it mean to be able to read an informational text or fictional text. And if you look at the standards, the Common Core standards, those are really broken down in ELA by those two components especially. And I think that's what Dr. was referring to by genres. I could be speaking for you there. And so by having this practice of teachers actually looking at the standard, they'll be able to pass on to know, okay, maybe in systems of equations for math, the student's proficient, but maybe not in geometric concepts. And so we'll be able to intervene specifically in the geometric concepts. Or for English language arts, maybe they're very proficient in what it looks like to read fictional text, but when it comes to informational text, they're struggling on what that looks like. So now, instead of focusing on just some broad spectrum in our intervention for the student, we'll be able to hone down specifically into that. And the goal is that we're not just passing kids from one grade level to the next without having that, but at least we have that, the new data metric, and we're able to intervene specifically in that area.
There is also the pedagogy piece of it, which you can do read alouds, but there are at least 4 different kinds of read alouds that you can do. And each one has a purpose, a goal, and an intent, right? So the teacher has to also know the purpose of what pedagogy they're using to address the needs of the students, right? Sometimes you're conferring, at other times you're doing shared reading experiences, or you're doing a read aloud for whatever the reasons are, right? I think that we have to get better at selecting the appropriate instructional tool to meet our students' needs. If a student, for example, struggles with fluency, because fluency does impact comprehension, if a student struggles with fluency, then what you want to do is model fluency and give them the opportunity to model fluency in reading as much as possible. A one and done is not going to do it. When students are word callers, they're not going to comprehend because they spend too much time laboring to get through the individual words on the text. You need the fluency so they can integrate the information and make meaning. If they're not making meaning, then we're not getting where we need to get to. So how do we teach kids to make meaning while reading, right? And that's where the book Mosaic of Thought comes in, because it talks about all the connections you can possibly make. Our teachers have to be intentional about that, especially at the lower grades. And kids love to be read to. Adults love to be read to, right? It just depends on what the topic is.
Director Green, I appreciate that you gave me a title that I have not yet earned.
Well, it's all that I did for you, accepted by faith.
That's right. So I think that in a way that is you're asking how are all these different pieces and steps that we're taking, how is this going to come in? Because we want changes now, right? Like we want to see achievement change now. And this is the later, it can be pretty later, but let's get the results now, is I think a little bit of what I'm hearing, right? And so I think, what I'm hearing from Dr. O, it's about clarity. What is what does it mean to be proficient reader? What does it mean to be at 4th grade? How's that the same or different at 5th or at 8th grade? Or what does that mean to be able to really work with complex text as you're a senior in high school? We should be able to speak to that and describe that. And I think that that's part of what the value of standards-based equitable grading practices do, is it helps with that description and clarity. But then what Dr. O is talking about is that's one part, but then you actually have to do the pedagogy and the teaching. So there's this part that, what I'm hearing is how do we bridge these two? These are not discrete things, and it's not how a student experiences a classroom. So how is this going to make something different for a student, and how quickly are we going to see that difference? I think are questions that you're asking, and I think that's something that that has been around for a long time, right? And what's going to be different this time around, I think, is a very excellent question. Appreciate it.
And I think in addition to that, I can say Senior Director Calvert or
thank you. Assistant Superintendent. Miss Calvert's fine, or Margaret's okay too.
But I want to put a handle on it, but I think the other piece to that I would look to, and that I'm trying to make sure that we address, and that is, how do we ensure, or what have we done to ensure that each of our educators is actually capable of teaching or presenting this information at the level at which we need to make sure that is done at? Like, what type of training have they been tested? Our kids get tested to make sure that they understand proficiency? Have the teachers been tested to make sure that they understand proficiency and that they're able to teach in more than one way? Because it's not a cookie cutter. Every student doesn't learn the same. So as an educator, it's my responsibility, it's my job to know how to teach at the multiple different levels at which kids learn. And what have we done to ensure that all the educators that are employed by PPS are capable of doing just that? And if they're not, then what do we have in place to get them to that point so that they can do it? Because at the end of the day, our kids, our future is what's at stake. And I don't have time for somebody's ego to be like, well, I shouldn't have to do this, or I don't want to do this, or, you know, I don't have time to do this, because we can't continue to wait for people to feel good about doing something before we do something that's going to be better for our students. Our future can't wait. It's not, we can't just, so what have we done to make sure that every educator is capable of doing what we need them to do, so that we can say with certainty that we can do this because everyone understands how to do it and everyone is capable of doing it? Now it's just a matter of how we roll it out. Because if we roll it out before everyone is capable of doing it, and I believe it was, I stole this one from Dr. Proctor, that the way you roll something out makes all the difference in the world. It makes all the difference in the world. You can have the best thing and you roll it out wrong and it sucks egg. Nobody gets anything from it. So it doesn't matter if we roll out a great thing if no one is capable of actually doing what we rolled out. So I guess I'm asking a layered questioning.
Director Green, this is Christina. I haven't spoken a lot tonight, but I'm happy to jump in on this. My previous role was Senior Director of Teacher Professional Learning, and I'm still actually currently doing that in addition to the Intern Chief role. And so just a few things, I completely agree with you. So just one thing to note is that all of our teachers have went through teacher training, they've taken tests, they're aligned to the content area that they've taught, right? So there's that aspect of their schooling, their certification process, TSPC, the state level mandates that exist there. And then when they come into our PPS system, we provide professional learning. And so all of the teachers that come into our system receive training around the curriculum. They receive initial training on the adopted curriculum that we just adopted. And then they have ongoing opportunities. Every school is allocated an instructional coach who also supports, because there's two parts to what I hear your question asking. One is around how are we developing and supporting our teachers? And then the other layer to that question is what happens after development and support doesn't happen? What do we do then? So that becomes an accountability question. And so to the first part around developing and coaching, what we've done this year is we've added coaches to every school site. Those are teacher leaders who were chosen by a robust interview process. They have an aligned job description that are versed in very, have a lot of instructional expertise. And so those instructional coaches lead professional learning at the school site. They help facilitate all of the professional learning communities, which are teacher groups in grade alike and content alike groups, where teachers really dive into the curriculum, the standards, they dive into data protocols. I heard a lot about the conversations around what happens when a student doesn't understand. That's one of the processes and one of the 4 questions that we dive into is what happens when a student does not master that learning. And that's part of the conversations they have at the school site. And so that's something that we've switched this year. And so I think what we're seeing is change. I know, and this is something that I know we've said over and over, but change takes time. And we made a drastic shift this year by deploying supports to school sites where we can develop that capacity of the teacher to be able to do what we're asking them to do. And so I think to the second part of that conversation around accountability, I think Margaret and Dr. O can share what they do on the school side, because that is a different type of conversation. We are really focusing in the Office of Teaching and Learning around development, coaching, support, PLCs where they're structured and have tons of systems level support that we built centrally to deploy to schools to be able to have those robust conversations around data. What happens when a student doesn't understand? What are my standards? What am I looking for? What is the assessment that we're shooting for? What happens when we're taking an assessment like MAP or OSAS and we're digging into that data? What does student work look like? And so those are all the conversations that are happening at the school site. I'm going to pause and let Margaret and Dr. O talk to the second layer of the conversation, which is around the accountability side.
So one of the things that I try to look for when I don't try, my eyes just go there. When I go to sites is exactly what the teacher is trying to teach, what's the learning target, and what's the student expected to know at the end of the lesson. So if I run into Esther in the hallway and I say, what did you learn in your last class? Esther can in one sentence tell me exactly what it is, right? So that's been a push, it's been a struggle, it's been a drive, I won't lie to you. Because sometimes you just don't see it. And when you don't see it, that tells me a number of things. It tells me, number one, that the teacher is not clear on what they want to teach. Number two, it tells me that the student isn't going to get much out of it because there isn't, our brains are wired to learn in ways that connect information. So when the information is not designed to be presented in that manner, we already interfere with the ability of the learner to receive the information. And when we interfere with the ability of the learner to receive the information, then you have issues in the classroom, and then there is truly no learning. You have what I call, what's the word that I use for it? I call it winging it, right? You pretend like you're teaching, but you're really not teaching, you're just running down the clock, right? So case in point, yesterday we were in a classroom that will remain unnamed. Friday we were in a classroom, and we walked in thinking the teacher was teaching something on calendars. This is lower primary. Then it became fractions. Then it became counting money. So I stood there and I said, okay, what are we supposed to learn? You look around the room, there's no learning target, there are no objectives. I'm sitting there going, okay, so what information is the teacher gathering about the students as learners in the classroom? Because there were those who were doing what she asked them to do, faithfully, and then there were those who were goofing around. So then I started thinking, I wonder why this child over here is goofing around. Is it because the task is too easy for them? Because that's the other thing. We have to know, otherwise we cause boredom to set it, right? So it's like, okay, well, how much do we really know about this child? So I stepped out with the SD and started having that conversation to say, we had no learning targets, we're guessing the lesson, right? We had a lot of strange student behaviors. You do that repeatedly over a couple of, days? I mean, you send a message to kids, right? And then we want to send out the smart ones and tell them that they are disruptive because we can't meet their need.
So can I presume from what you just stated that all teachers are required to have like lesson plans that that show this is what each one of our learning targets are?
I am going to put that question to Dr. Proctor and Christina.
Yeah, school supervision, I think.
Yeah, you guys have school supervision, it's the principal's expectation, so you tell us, what do the principals expect that?
Well, so here's the thing.
Yes.
It is definitely not in the contract. And when it's not in the contract, it's hard to enforce, right? It is an expectation. So you have schools where you can say it, and your teachers look at they'll do it, and then you have others where they'll tell you, we don't have to do it, it's not required. So what's the standard language and expectation from the district level? Which is why I said, pointed to Dr. Proctor and Christina. If we just have something that says everybody is expected to write lesson plans, then we can truly get behind it. But now it's in the job description and it's in this, it's, you know,
Yeah.
It's in the teacher evaluation.
Yeah, it's a part of teacher evaluation, it's a part of the evaluation rubric that principals are using, it's a part of Danielson. It's also part of TSPC, educator, code of ethics and standards of conduct. So that language is there. It really is for the school supervisors to work with leaders to ensure that we are doing that. I'm sorry, we're at a time and I'm gonna have to run, so forgive me.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good evening.
Have a great evening.
All right, I just want to cut this
Happy
short.
New
real
Year.
quick. I want to call on JJ. I know your hand's been up for a while, so I just give you last thing, and then we're just going to close it off here after JJ's question or comment, or.
Yeah, I just really want to say thank you to Director Green for his questions he asked. I think, those are questions we really need answers to. And, as a Black student, who has an IEP, who, sometimes fell through the cracks, I think it's really good hearing about, this grading practice, but sometimes the support, and I've seen many other Black students fell through the cracks, but the support we need is, smaller class sizes, because it's very hard to get that extra support, when we have amazing teachers at McDaniels, but it's extremely hard to get that individual support when we are, our teachers are dealing with 30 students. And especially, we have amazing paraeducators, but we don't have enough to fully support our students. So I think it's great that we're looking at these grading practices, but I think the root causes of this is something we should really be addressing and looking into more.
Thank you, JJ. Really good comment. I know there's still a lot of questions. I still have a great question on grading, but I want to respect everyone's time. We might just punt a little bit of this discussion to the next one, if that's okay. And then I would like to, unless anyone has any last comments, I just want, again, respect everyone's time. I think we need to save some of this conversation for next time. And last call.
I just want to throw in an analogy if I can, just because student success in general, and it really builds to the next meeting.
Yeah, as long as it's under a minute, I want to get everyone out.
Yes. Playing in the street with your child on a residential block, it has the 20, it's plenty signs. You have car drives through, hits your kid's on the ground. You see this truck driving off. You have 3 choices. You can immediately stop everything and address your child. You can chase the truck, get the license plate, what's going on. You can call the police, hey, I need help. Call an ambulance, hey, I need help. And I feel like right now, we're kind of focusing on the truck. Let's keep the next kid from getting hit, but we're not addressing the one laying on the pavement right now. So my hope is just at some of these student success meetings, we're talking about the one laying on the ground. That's like practical terms. Hit it. Don't worry, because I'm in it.
Thank you. That's great feedback.
Appreciate you.
All right. With that, the meeting's adjourned. Have a good Monday.
Oh, yeah.
Good night, everyone.